Welcome to Monnet Conversations. I'm Anthony Elliott. The global crisis of COVID-19 has dominated worldwide media headlines throughout 2020 and looks set to do so throughout 2021. Those headlines and that global crisis have been at the core of an unraveling of the relationship between economy and society. Responses to coronavirus, from politicians to policymakers to the public, has brought into sharp relief a binary choice which has opened up between, on the one hand, public health and on the other hand, the economy. For those on the side of public health, the argument has been that COVID-19 represents a public health crisis the likes of which the world has not previously seen now for over 100 years. But for other critics and commentators, whatever the threats and dangers to public health of COVID-19, this is nothing compared to the fallout facing the global economy. The global crisis of COVID-19 is said now to threaten worldwide systems of production, of consumption, of travel, transport and tourism, as well as systems of pleasure and leisure, raising fears of untold dangers and risks to the global economy itself, both now and into the future. In today's episode of Monnet Conversations, we're going to be asking the question, is this binary division between public health on the one side and the economy on the other actually the most productive way to address the crisis of COVID-19? And to do so, we're going to be drawing partially and provisionally from the contributions of recent European thought, in particular the contributions of the late Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and of the late German social theorist Ulrich Beck. Ulrich Beck's magisterial Risk Society argued that risk today has become bound up with the new global electronic economy in dramatically new ways, a world in which we live on the edge of high technological innovation and scientific development, but where no one fully understands the possible global risks and the dangers that we face. Beck's arguments have profoundly transformed the ways in which we come to think about risk in relationship to societies, nature and ecology, intimate relationships, politics, and democracy. Zygmunt Bauman was one of the world's most influential social thinkers, and his foundational book, Liquid Modernity, developed the argument that the solid world of jobs for life and marriages till death us do part had become replaced by a new liquid world of short-term contracts and relationships until further notice. Well, to explore these issues and questions today, I'm joined by Peter Baalharts, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at La Trobe University in Australia, from Sven Kesselring, Professor of Automotive Management at NGU in Germany, and Ingrid Bise from the Swedish School of Social Sciences at the University of Helsinki. Sven, I'll start with you if I can. Risk society, as Beck defined it, was a world where we have to make these kind of ongoing decisions about how to live with unprecedented dangers. In terms of COVID-19, do you think it's in any way feasible to try to break away from this dualism that I was talking about between public health on the one side and economics on the other, by seeing the global pandemic as one of the side effects of successful modernization, as seeing coronavirus as a side effect of the massive global digital flows that we live with today?
When I was thinking about this conversation, I thought back to one of Ulrich Beck's famous quotes, where he says, "Poverty is hierarchic and smog is democratic." And I think what we actually observe today is to see that this pandemic situation is democratic in the sense that nobody is actually going to be left out of this situation. So in that sense, like dichotomies to say it's either health or it's the economic situation doesn't grab actually the this brutal disruption that is happening there. because it interferes into all spheres of life. It interferes into economy. I think we are seeing an extremely risky and dangerous situation for a lot of economic spheres, economic sectors today. We see, of course, a health crisis, but we also see a crisis of like social interaction, of communication, of coming together, community, the whole life, social life that we actually are used to have. Is kind of interfered from the pandemic situation. In that sense, I would say classical dichotomies doesn't actually meet the relevance of the situation, because it's just everywhere.
So in terms of it not meeting those, as it were, the old categories no longer fitting these new realities, how do you see this in terms of the notion of risk society? In what ways is COVID-19, we hear so much of the language of the media has been that this is unprecedented. We've got an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented today. That much is certainly clear. But in terms of the nature of the changing parameters of risk, could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think the warnings and the possible outcomes of the modern way of producing, of consumption, of traveling, of connecting like a network society across the globe, it's decades long. So I think we are climate crisis and all that. So, what probably Ulrich Beck would say, what we observe today is an example per se of reflexive modernization, of a huge boomerang effect that is happening there. Because we made the world in the way as we have it today. This virus is actually traveling within bodies. It's traveling around the globe. There is no outside. So in that sense, what Beck would actually probably say, we have a new situation of like internal affairs politics that is on a global scale, that is cosmopolitan in that sense. And the pandemic and COVID-19 is actually put on the agenda all these issues of solidarity, of collaboration, of global governance, all these issues. Because there is no national politics, there is no national scale politics that can actually solve the problem. So in that sense, Ulrich Beck was always talking very positively about the cosmopolitan society, but this is the other side of the dark side of the cosmopolitan society that we can see there. That the reflexive modernization is actually kind of present in everyday life.
Well, we'll come to cosmopolitanism a little later, but certainly in terms of what you've sketched out, I'm thinking, global side effects, institutional boomerangs. I mean, Peter Baalhart's much of this, of course, sounds a little bit like also the language of liquidization. What's your take on what's happening?
I'm not sure exactly where to begin, partly because I suppose in Australia, where I'm sitting, the frames of reference are local and regional and fairly clearly differentiated across the states. But there's also our media responses to China and to the US. And the extent of the crisis in the US in particular, I think, is something which, even though it doesn't possess us, actually, somehow is possessive for us and of us. Bauman wrote many books. Some of them coincide with Beck's, and of course they were friends. I think Bauman was probably a little more old-fashioned, and so am I, when it comes to talking about the asymmetrical distribution of life chances. I agree with Sven that in a sense we're all together in this, but it depends on who you talk to. It depends on who you ask. The leading Indigenous scholar, Kim Scott, wrote in The Guardian, I think quite accurately, that Black Australians are not in the same boat. The boats are different. Some of the boats are much more insulated and protected, and even in a relatively safe case like Australia, the differentials that have been revealed are of no surprise at all to sociologists or other people in social sciences, but seem to have come as a shock to those who had no idea about precarity or had no idea about casual labour, about casual work. Around Melbourne, where I live, there's a number of hoardings. I guess they're on the tram stops, which say thanks to the janitors, thanks to the hotel workers, thanks to the people who are stacking shelves. It's a kind of touching gesture, and I'm not out of sympathy with it, but it's difficult not to feel that this is a kind of reaction to a moment of disruption, and that our Australian citizens are waiting for this to go away. They think it will go away, and we'll be back to normal. We'll be back to exactly where we were a year ago.
Well, certainly in terms of disruptions, as you say, that's one thing. But beyond disruption, as we know, coronavirus is also deathly. Zygmunt Bauman wrote a book titled Collateral Damage, and working off from the rise of that term in military operations, he went on to argue that we can see collateral damage operating in various ways across economies and societies in terms of particularly the sort of human personal terms of collateral damage. So I want to read you a quote from that book where he wrote that casualties are dubbed collateral insofar as they're dismissed as not important enough to justify the costs of their prevention, or simply unexpected because the planners did not consider them worthy of inclusion. So to press the point, Peter, I mean, we're at a stage at the moment, so over 200,000 people dead in the United States, over 1 million people dead worldwide, over 30 million bodies infected with coronavirus. In terms of how we, and it was Sven that highlighted the importance of bearing in mind that it is people, that it is human bodies that are the carriers of this global pandemic. The notion of collateral damage in the light of COVID-19, what do you make of that? And is it useful for us as social scientists, and just in broader terms in public political debate, to look at the fallout? That we hear so much about the economic fallout, but what about the human costs? What about the fallout in personal terms to lives and to our lives in these times?
It's an old argument, isn't it? An old, I guess, social democratic argument, connected in Australia with people like Hugh Stratton about what constitutes productivity, about what constitutes GNP. Crash a car, you contribute to GNP. Bake a cake, you don't. There's a whole mentality that goes with this. There are notions in Bauman that are very useful. I think at a slightly more abstract level, there are still notions in thinkers like C.B. Macpherson that are worth thinking about. Possessive individualism. What concerns me is that if we pick up on the more specifically political inflection of Bauman, we're in a kind of hiatus. So I think it was 20 years ago, he wrote this book called In Search of Politics. And the object was a commonly shared object to identify that there was no shared space in which we could actually decide democratically what our priorities might be. Now that space, whatever it was then, has contracted dramatically The idea or the language of social movements is something that really doesn't have much purchase when social movements are working on a terrain where the other side is bearing arms. The space within which politics might be articulated is something that's even more compromised than it was before. So I think I'm kind of still shocked, even after the months that we've had of this experience, by the absolute severity of the hiatus and our absolute incapacity to enter into it in a way other than to revive the regulative politics of social democracy, which in Australia is what's happened, right? The Conservative government have become social democrats. They've become re-regulators. They've become big spenders. Not a bad idea, but does it address the future? Absolutely not. It's a 6-month strategy. So this compression of political space is something which I think is really disturbing and makes it very difficult for people to connect up the dots between talking about health and the economy.
Ingrid Bise, I'd like to bring you in here, because if politics has been struggling to develop some interesting sounding answers to the challenges that COVID-19 presents, so too have women and men in their everyday lives. I mean, the speed with which COVID-19 swept across nations and the speed with which it particularly started to transform lifestyles. We heard a great deal about lifestyle change back in March and April, and how people were very quickly and speedily adapting to life in lockdown and starting to reinvent all sorts of aspects of both their working life and their personal lives. You've written extensively on lifestyle change, and I know that you've also drawn in your own work from the standpoints developed by both Zygmunt Bauman and Ulrich Beck. In terms of the lifestyle changes that you see going on, given that we're now well beyond the 6-month mark, what do you make of these changes, and what do you think is particularly important?
Well, first, I think I have to echo what I believe Peter said about how this affects, the pandemic affects people differently all across society. Yes, it's a global pandemic, and it affects us all, but it affects us all in slightly different ways depending on where we are geographically, which country we live in, depending on race, on class, what kind of jobs we have. I mean, as we know, the office worker was suddenly forced to start working remotely, and that actually went relatively well. Then there are a lot of people who haven't been able to start working remotely and just haven't been working and have been in lockdown. And then there are people, like healthcare workers who have been working, more than everyone else in very risky situations, and have gotten, many have gotten sick. And so the situation is very different depending on who you ask, of course. And then also it's been more severe in some countries than it's been in other countries. But regarding lifestyle changes, well, it's quite interesting because, sort of looking over or sort of reflecting back on the work that both Beck and Bauman have done, and it strikes me that this pandemic sort of intensifies everything they've been talking about. So, risk, and, the perception of risk is suddenly even more extreme. All of a sudden, it's not just the regular risk we were used to before the pandemic. Now we are acutely aware of that there's a risk to our health and to our lives, and we might die. The sort of reflective project is also, more extreme. All of a sudden we're forced, or we're like at home, especially those of us in lockdown, or the people who are in lockdown are forced to reflect and can reflect and have time to reflect. So it strikes me that this is it's intensified to a point that is completely different than it was before. At the same time, I have to say, following people's reactions on social media and reflections of the lockdown, I think our situation in Finland, I am in Finland, was probably different from many other places, because in Finland we have a lot of space. So even though there was a lockdown, we were able to move around. I, for example, live very close to a small forest. So even though I had to, isolate from other people, I was able to move around in this forest freely. And I think the lockdown for people who can move around like that isn't as hard as it is if you're, stuck in an apartment somewhere and you're not allowed to go outside. So, so on the one hand, what I saw last spring, or, in March, April, May, during, the first worst lockdown, was that while people, on the one hand, those of the people who weren't healthcare workers, who were stuck in their homes and didn't have a lot to do, on the one hand, it was very frustrating, of course, because all of a sudden you weren't allowed to go anywhere and people were dreaming about just going. But on the other hand, I think there were a lot of people who were very relieved that there was no place for them to be. So time sort of slowed down. All of a sudden, they weren't expected to be, in a million places at the same time, doing a million different things. Their only job was to be at home. And for me, for example, to walk in the forest. So I think, it's been very mixed.
Yes, Ingrid, your reflections there make me think of Ulrich Beck's comment or remarks that he made somewhere, that you can't have individualized solutions to global systemic problems. This sure looks like a global systemic problem. And yet it was also Zygmunt Bauman that argued that increasingly what we see occurring in worldwide politics today is the rapid privatization of global risks and of collective political problems. We've seen this play out with a vengeance, haven't we, with COVID-19? And if you think about the emphasis that's, whether it's masks, whether it's social distancing, washing your hands, quarantine, there's been a relentless message that it is you and you alone that is kind of, navigating this territory, and that there's really no one else to blame but you and you alone in terms of this navigating the whole terrain of COVID-19. In terms of that privatization of politics, and I'm not neglecting, at least I don't think I'm neglecting, the fact that there have been radical differences, obviously, in how different nation states, in how different polities have handled these crises. Whether we look at, Germany, Australia or Finland, where there have been developed policy responses compared to many countries, and most notably the United States and Brazil, for example, have been roundly condemned and criticized for their lack of a developed public health policy. Nonetheless, we see different elements of this kind of privatizing of the pandemic itself. I'm just wondering what the responses are from you on this, and what your thinking is about this. Is this a kind of just an unbearable pressure? Is it just a displacement of the political challenge that institutional politics can't rise to the challenge itself?
Well, I have to say, I think, it varies from country to country, and like you said. So, for example, in Finland, the politics have been very clear, and I was talking to a friend in the U.S. the other day, and she was saying, that now, when schools are starting, she has to decide, for example, will she send her kids to school, or will she continue keeping them at home? And apparently in the United States, the responsibility rests much more on the individual shoulders than they do here in Finland, for example. Here, they decide that this is going to be our strategy and this is what we're going to do in the whole country. And you as an individual don't have to decide, is it too risky to send your child to school or not? But at the same time, even in a country like Finland, where it has been, we have had very clear sort of instructions of what to do and how. It still sort of falls to the individual to be responsible, to, follow the recommendations, to, keep distance from other people, to wear a face mask on public transportation, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I have to say, I read somewhere that in a time of crisis, people tend to put more trust in authorities than during other times. And I think this is true for Finland, for example, where, the message has been very clear that this is what's going on, this is going to be our strategy, and this is what we're doing. I think that people have come together and sort of, there is, of course, debate here too, that are we neglecting the economy? Are we putting, too much effort in just trying to save people's lives? And, is the COVID-19 really that dangerous? But I think on a whole, people have basically put a lot of faith into the strategies. But I know that's also different, but I think in different countries, but I think one of the reasons it's different is also in, how clear is the message from the government? How collected is the government? Here, politicians have been very sort of collected in their viewpoints.
It might be worth looking at some aspects of that a little more closely. I mean, if you look at the politics of COVID-19, politics, certainly in the aftermath of COVID-19, has become in part a politics of wearing a mask or not. I mean, in terms of the kind of political cleavage in the United States, what we're seeing, for example, between Republican non-mask wearers and Democrats wearing masks has been absolutely extraordinary. And Sven Kesselring, I'm reminded that Ulrich Beck argued that risk society is in part a move beyond the politics of left and right. What do you think?
Yeah, that's actually a quite interesting question. I think it's what we actually see in Germany, for example, is that we actually get politics from beyond the far left to the far right, so that we actually have an extremely messy situation right now, when there are like demonstrations where people are mixing up like left-wing groups with right-wing groups against the state, against the suppression of the individual and the individual rights, and it's mixed up with conspiracy theories. So I think this is a huge terrain actually of sub-politics that is happening there. So what we can see actually in the COVID-19 situation right now is that it opens up for a lot of policies and a lot of different interests. The whole range of society is actually getting visible on the streets, in public debates, in the social media, wherever it is. And the whole question, and I think what Ingrid actually said is this like pushing the responsibility on the individual. What we can see, for example, in the strategy that Sweden was actually choosing to say that it's on the individual's responsibility to take care of the health of other people, so which is embedded in a welfare state tradition actually in many ways. But then it mixes up with a lot of ideas about who should take care of whom and who should actually be a strong player in that game. So I think this is a very interesting and exciting, but also like threatening and dangerous, like messy situation that we are observing there. And what I actually what I try to find out in the whole situation is where are actually consistent policies showing up there. For example, the whole situation. Today, I read in the newspaper that in a poll amongst German companies, they were asking, what do you actually learn from this situation? And about 70% of the companies said that in the future they will have a totally different situation of working. So there is a sort of a learning happening there. That means that companies actually what we discussed in our work on mobility and reflexivity in the past, a new configuration of presence and virtual work, digitalization. So a lot of projects of digitalization, they are speeding up to an amount that we never have expected in that sense. So where is consistent policies? I think Ingrid said sometimes we're missing a clear statement from the state where it's actually the direction to go in that. So it's not that anyone else wants to have like going back to old state-centered politics, but in that sense, learnings out of the situation and learning from the reflexivity in the sense that that clear strategies can be identified. That's actually something that is. There are also not only the negative side effects. There are also kind of a positive side effects coming out of this situation.
I mean, there's certainly been no end of multinational companies saying that for 2021 they're going to keep in place the remote working arrangements that they'd set up in 2020 to initially deal with COVID-19. There are many other companies that are saying even beyond COVID-19 that remote working is likely to be their preferred option. I mean, you've got a company like Siemens announcing that over 300,000 employees will have that option. Google have announced that their staff will continue to work from home in 2021. Do you think this is, as it were, just an acceleration of trends and trajectories that were already underway as a result of the digital revolution?
Yeah, but some of that is actually that there are concepts which have already been there. They are taken out of the box and they are now going to be applied. But what we actually also see there, it's a new definition of normality. So I think what has been like, it was Charles Perrow who wrote that book about the normal accidents. He was strongly focusing on nuclear power, but actually the pandemic situation leads us actually quite into the same direction. This is a new normal. This is the new normal in many ways. So we all thought maybe in half a year, or maybe it takes a year, but then we're actually coming back, returning to the normality that we always thought this is the way how we want to live, how we want to work, how we want to interact and practice community. But in fact, I think we are turning into a situation where a new normality is actually arising. And this is by coming back to Ulrich Beck's work. Ulrich always said that there is a new modernity coming up, a new modernity where all these categories that we are taking for granted are zombie categories. So what presence, co-presence, intimacy, all these notions that are essential to describe society, they need to be renegotiated in this situation. And I would say what is happening in the whole sphere of work and collaboration, globalization is in the process of being redefined in many ways. In that sense, there are a lot of concepts that have been dormant concepts in many ways that are now getting a totally different meaning and relevance. So like collaboration between Germany and Australia, like our collaboration, gets under these circumstances a different quality. So we can keep up a global network of researchers without meeting in the same place. And this is also that we need to learn. It's not either or. So this, again, using a term that Beck was using quite a lot. It's not either or, it's the and. So I think a lot of companies, they actually say the hybrid form of working. Just what the discussion was, where is it a really necessary trap? All that comes in a different quality in everyday work today. To think about, do I seriously need to travel to Australia, or do I can I use new technologies to organize this kind of close collaboration in a different way. So this is also, but I want to come back to another aspect that Ingrid was actually saying, because I said at the beginning this quote that poverty is hierarchic and the pandemic situation is democratic. The threat is democratic, but the strategies from the individual level to the state level to the global level is quite different. Of course, there is on the one hand side, like Brazil and the US, who are more or less rejecting the relevance and the redefinition of that as not existing as Trump does. But on the other side, very strong state-driven strategies. But also on the private level, it's a huge range depending from what resources you have, what kind of education, what kind of social background, what kind of cultural capital. Are you getting into a situation of being isolated, cut off from social relations because you're like, you have low financial capital, you have low social capital, you have handicaps or whatever. So the strategy or the individual situation is hugely different, and so in that sense, it's not democratic, but the threat is actually quite democratic and pushing it on, disrupting into everybody's life. And we can't reject it. There's no way out of the situation in that sense.
A new normality and a new modernity were the terms you mentioned, referring in part to a decomposition and a recomposition of various social, cultural and political forms. Peter, is that, do you think, part and parcel of an unbearable liquidity and lightness of what now is the COVID-19 era?
Liquidity.
Well, it certainly sounds, in terms of much of your own work and your thinking and the work that you've done with Zygmunt Bauman, I'm thinking we're clearly in an environment where the targets keep moving and where nothing's standing still.
Yeah, look, I still find as an ambient sort of concept, I still find the notion useful, and I would be in sympathy with you if I understood rightly. You were suggesting that these trends were now accentuated, that they were becoming more profound, that precarity, uncertainty are becoming, certainly, as Sven says, the new normal. I think one of the interesting aspects of the moment that we inhabit, the four of us together, is that we have some strong bonds to these theoretical traditions, which do have still significant elasticity within them. But at the same time, our thinkers, Bauman and Beck, have both departed at the very moment when the kinds of intellectual challenges that confront us are really exponentially increased. I mean, one of the throwaways of Bauman, he liked throwaways of a particular kind, intellectual kind, was that, and this was 20 years ago at least, the overproduction of information, the overproduction of intelligence, the overproduction of publication was such that none of us could any longer master a field. None of us as citizens could really maneuver a repertoire sufficient to understand what was going on in the world. This seems to be something that's new, and I think in this regard, while I'm committed to the idea of continuity with this intellectual legacy of thinkers like Bauman and Beck, Anthony, it strikes me that it's actually work like that of your own in, for example, the AI field, or work that you and Sven and others do in mobility, which is where the ball is going, because we simply don't know what the trends are. And the trends are, in a sense, empirical. as a coder, for example, we are rethinking or renegotiating pragmatically the question of the state. That's probably not especially intellectually expansive. We're bound to rethink the nature of the universities. The nature of the universities in Australia will be completely transformed by the combination of COVID and the Chinese, Indian reduction in overseas students. I mean, what the Australian university system is going to look like in 10 years, but I'd also, as a question, ask what the British university system will look like after 10 years of Brexit. We really have absolutely no idea. The other coda, which I'd like to throw in, which other people know much more about than me, is the reevaluation of science. I mean, the critical theory tradition, broadly speaking, from which our thinkers may be said to emerge in a particular sense, had a distance from science, which really needs completely to be revalued, I think, in the present moment. The status of science and scientific discourse is something which has become divisive in a way that nobody could have imagined, I dare say, in the golden years of capitalism in the 50s and 60s.
I want to ask you to take a leap, as it were, a leap of the imagination, and this may be a leap too far, but just in terms of what you've sketched out there, Peter, had Zygmunt Bauman lived to see COVID-19, and yes, I mean, of course, there is so much emphasis when talking about Bauman to talk about all the books with the term liquid in it. One book of his, which I know that matters a lot to you and it matters a lot to me, is his book Wasted Lives. It seems especially poignant in the broader context of what's happening in the COVID era. Where do you think his work might have gone as a result of this crisis that we're seeing, whether it's just an acceleration of trends and trajectories that were already underway, or whether it would have ignited some radical departure and further extension in his thought? Could you care to speculate on that?
What may have come next? I think that in a very sad sense, Bauman died at the right time. I mean, he'd engaged with the world that he inhabited, the solid modernity that the Poles sought to construct and the West sought to construct. What followed from it, the incipient transformation into liquid modernity, new modernity. I'm not sure that he would have been any better or especially equipped to address these changes than any of us or anyone else. But this notion of waste is something which I think is probably, for reasons I don't quite understand, underworked. Bauman was criticised for an obsession with consumption. But part of his obsession with consumption was an obsession with waste, or philosophically, you would say, with an interest in the notion of limits. The notion of limits is something that my young friends talk about every day. It's perhaps not something that their parents or my generation talk about. But I think there's certainly a new space available for the rediscussion of limits. I mean, we talk with disdain and impatience about mask culture. The streets are full of the things, right? I mean, the levels of pollution that we're all managing to generate while we're at home is absolutely phenomenal. There are very successful campaigns in cities like Melbourne to get down the level of takeout coffee cup consumption. All of that's gone. As we've taken, as Ingrid says, this very kind of compulsorily personal response to managing our personal lives and generated a great deal of waste. But as a closing remark on that issue, Anthony, just to reiterate, I think the point that Bauman was so taken by was the waste of life. Whether it's in quality or quantity, whoever lives in particular we're speaking about, Bauman had something like a sociology of surplus populations, which I think has not been picked up. The idea that over the last several hundred years, the push-pull of migration has involved something much more significant, much more ethically profound, much more humanly compromising than the statistics might suggest.
And the same question to you, Sven, in terms of that imaginative leap as to where Ulrich Beck and where his intellectual project might have gone. I mean, it's very, I think, interesting to note that at the end of his life, Beck was working on issues of climate change. He had worked for such a long time generally on questions of ecological modernization, and the whole set of fears and forebodings about an ecological catastrophe, a looming global economic catastrophe, certainly preoccupied him. COVID-19 seems in many ways to be something that from one angle fits very well into Beck's sociology, but from another angle, do you think this would have pushed him into new directions?
Well, I think necessarily. It's a couple of weeks ago that somebody, I don't know this author, Adam Tooze, he published a paper in a newspaper, The Sociologist Who Could Save Us from Coronavirus. So I think this is a situation that Ulrich, he got very often in this situation that he should have been the prophet who is showing the way out of a actually unbearable situation or extremely risky situation. And I think if we take for the discussion about nuclear power, I think Ulrich was very clear in that. In the end, he was part of an advisory board for the German government after Fukushima, who was opting out of nuclear power, or was recommending the German government to opt out of nuclear power, what in the end also happened. I think the situation with coronavirus would have put him into a totally different theoretical situation. So instead of thinking about what could actually be a very clear strategy to deal with the situation, he needed to have a theoretical answer on the question, how can we actually live in this new normality? How can we actually, what kind of political, what kind of social, what kind of individual and collective reactions and answers do we have on a situation that we're not going to get out of? And the whole humankind, mankind actually can't step out of this pandemic situation for quite a while. So we don't know what's going to come. But what is going to stay with that is that I think this wearing this mask is a constant reminder that this is going to be, even if we find a vaccine, and it's going to take years until everybody in like billions of people going to be treated with that vaccine, but that the constant threat will stay. I think this is a situation of no return. It's point of no return for all kinds of societies and for all people on different hierarchies, social hierarchies. In that sense, you said that Bauman died in quotation marks at the right time. I would say maybe Ulrich did that too, because I'm not sure if he would have had an answer on this. And normalizing and accepting, I think what I always appreciated with working with him and seeing him think and theorizing situations is that he was always engaged and like driven from the need to find a way out of this. And what we have now is, and you before you asked me about the acceleration, I think this is a very, very central point, and Peter also mentioned that. In some ways, it's accelerating a lot of things. It's speeding up a lot of things. So the whole digitalization and artificial intelligence and the move from what Ulrich would have said from a second modernity into a third digital modernity, that is happening at a speed 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen that coming. But also in the cities, the transformation of cities, pop-up bike lanes, suddenly there is an openness for alternative sustainable mobility strategies. But on the other side, I think I'm seriously worried about seeing what happens actually with climate change policies, what is going to happen with the European Green Deal, what is going to happen with social equality strategies and policies, what is going to happen with equal pay strategies in the industry. I think the trade unions that are facing, in Germany at least, and I guess probably all over the world, are facing quite a hot phase in fall, where it's about securing jobs, how to organize, how to manage the social ecological transformation of production systems, consumption systems. Because I think, coming back to your question about Beck, what he would probably have said is, this is a sort of a backlash that we're actually experiencing right now. It puts on the everyday agenda of every individual that this way of living, this way of consuming, this way of producing, of traveling, of interacting on a global scale is not sustainable, is unsustainable for the future. But where is the way out of this? Where is the way out of this, like, juggernaut that is racing on high speed in some ways? And this is probably the challenge that we are facing, to think about policy strategies, socially equal strategies to deal with that situation.
This point of no return, of lives wasted and of wasted lives, it still doesn't stop some people from trying to find the exits. And Ingrid, you've written extensively about people opting out. You've written extensively in particular about women opting out. And I know that you're now working on studies of men opting out. I'm wondering, in terms of COVID-19, what you're seeing on the ground in terms of whether those that have opted out are in some sense better placed for the crisis that's unfolded this year?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I want to bring back the discussion to the new normal, and that also is closely related to my opting out research, because basically the people who opt out, or the people I have studied who have opted out, they've sort of opted out of what has been considered normal or the expected way of doing things. And like Sven said, you know, there are a lot. What we're seeing changes happening in organizations and how work is done, and that's the beauty, of course, of a crisis, is that when you have to experience something different and do something differently, that's when you get the light bulb moments and you realize that you can do something differently. So a lot of companies have had, you know, this light bulb moment when they've realized that not only was this work that we thought impossible to do remotely possible, but it might actually be a really good thing too. And so they, you know, so they want to keep this going forward. But having said that, I think that we need to not underestimate that there are a lot of people who are just waiting to go back to how things were before. So there are a lot of people who are seeing positive change that has been forced upon them, but they're seeing it as positive, and you know, and they see this being a part of the way they go about things going forward. But then there are also a lot of people who are just waiting, you know, to go back. When we talk about the new normal, I think that the pandemic is, of course, one thing, and you know, and the, you know, the new activities and the new routines and practices that we've adopted during the pandemic is one thing. But eventually we will hopefully have a vaccine, and this will be something that we write about in our history books. But the real new normal, I believe, going forward, and the thing that people aren't thinking about so much now because it doesn't, you know, it isn't top of mind, is the environment, and are the environmental problems. and when we talk about waste and, and Bauman's work around wasted lives, and we talk about human waste, but we also talk about the waste that humans now more than ever produce, we're also seeing the waste of non-human lives, which is very problematic and is happening at a really very accelerated rate. So I think that when we talk about the new normal, I don't know, perhaps the new normal is that we don't have a normal, but I think that the long run connotations are actually more focused on the environment and environmental problems.
Well, with that, we are out of time. Ingrid Bisay, Sven Kesselring, and Peter Bellhardt, thanks very much for joining us on Monnet Conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.